Okay, Assalamualaikum. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for attending the guest lecture series in the Sociology Department, Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas 11 Maret. And we are very grateful for Prof. Nancy's willingness to attend and share knowledge in this morning event. We also really appreciate Prof. Nancy kindness, who must be very busy, but still willing to make time for all of us here. So it's also 9 p.m., 11 p.m. in Boston. And we apologize for disturbing you, Prof. Nancy. Once again, thank you very much for coming and to save time because we are holding it online and because it's already night in Boston. So this event will begin with a speech from the head of the Sociology Department UNS. I invite Dr. Argyo Demartoto. Time is yours, Pak Argyo.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Yuyun Sunesti, as the moderator on this occasion. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Especially good night for Prof. Nancy in Boston. Yeah, and also early morning for Pesembua in Namibia. Yeah. Okay, I'm Argyo Demartoton, the head of the Sociology Department of Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas 11 Maret, Surakarta. I am very glad to be here to welcome you all at the Sociology Department guest lecture series this semester. So as the head of the Sociology Department, please allow me to welcome and thank you especially Prof. Nancy Smith Hefner for being willing to take the time to share your knowledge with our students here, which we understand that you must be very busy at the head of the anthropology department at Boston University, USA. Once again, thank you for your support for the development of knowledge in Indonesia. So for information, the Sociology Department is making serious effort to bring world-class scholars and professors to share their knowledge with our students that we can have direct discussion and exchange ideas. So hopefully this guest lecture activities can provide an experience for us and can be continued with other collaboration in the future. We do hope that the event like this, especially with Prof. Nancy, will continue in the years to come with more varied activities such as joint research or joint publication. So that's all from me. Once again, welcome to UNS Prof. Nancy Smith Hefner, and thank you very much. Enjoy your lecturer. So, Ibu Yuyun, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Argyo Demartoto. The next is a guest lecture from Prof. Nancy Smith Hefner from Boston University. And our moderator today is Alifa Septiana. Alifa is a student in the 7th grade, yeah, of the Sociology Department. So please welcome Alifa. Time is yours.
Hi, am I audible? I am. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Alifa, and I'm a last year sociology student here in ONS, and I'll be moderating our discussion for today. All right, before we go into the lecture, a quick short bio for our guest today, all the way from Boston, Massachusetts, Professor Nancy J.Smith Hefner. She is a linguistic anthropologist and specialist of religion and gender in Southeast Asia. Her early research included projects on language, identity, and gender socialization in Java, Indonesia, as well as identity and moral education among Cambodian refugees in the United States. Her current research is focused on questions of gender and sexuality among Muslim Japanese youth. Her book, Islamizing Intimacies, Youth Sexuality, and Gender in Contemporary Indonesia, published in 2019, traces recent trends and controversies in Muslim youth culture in Java. She is currently working on the completion of a short monograph on youth and romance in Indonesia. She is also the co-editor of Waithood, Gender, Education, and Global Delays in Marriage, published in 2020. Okay, so we will list yours.
Okay, sorry, I missed the very last part, but I thank you for the introduction. Dan pertama-tama saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Bu Yuyun dan Pak Arhio dan juga Alifa karena telah terbaik hati mengundang saya ke Universitas Saudara, yaitu Universitas 11 Maret. Saya merasa terhormat bisa bicara dengan saudara sekalian hari ini. Saya juga mau minta maaf sebelumnya karena saya akan memakai bahasa Inggris hari ini. Sudah lama saya tidak bisa jalan-jalan ke Indonesia karena COVID. Dan saya khawatir bahasa Indonesia saya kurang lancar. Akan tetapi, saya telah membuat PowerPoint slide dengan poin-poin saya yang paling penting dari makalah saya, dan saya senang kalau pertanyaan saudara nanti adalah dalam bahasa Indonesia atau bisa juga dalam bahasa Inggris, terserah. Okay, so to start, I'm going to talk today about Muslim women and delayed marriage in Indonesia, which is a topic that I have been working on for some time. You are probably all aware that in recent decades, Indonesia has seen a shift away from the heavy-handed authoritarianism of a conservative developmentalist state under Suharto to the growing influence of varieties of Islam in both public and private realms. During this same period, Indonesia, of course, has been modernizing, and that's been happening at a remarkable pace. And a neoliberal discourse of self-improvement and self-development has permeated youth culture. An important aspect of this modernizing discourse is the idea that romantic love is the proper foundation for a modern companionate marriage. Young people today reject earlier forms of arranged marriage and insist that they won't rely on their parents or their elders or elder family members to choose a partner for them. A surprising number of young people, however, including educated Muslim women, reject modern dating as a means of premarital familiarization, as something that's immoral. Some turn instead to popular Muslim preachers, ustad, ulama, who admonish young people to just marry quickly, to avoid sin, and to varieties of Muslim matchmaking services that assist young people in finding a life partner. In all cases, at least in the ideal, aspiring middle-class youth put off serious relationships with members of the opposite sex until they've completed their degrees and obtained secure employment. A pattern that has resulted in dramatically later age of marriage among Indonesian youth, especially among educated women. So what I'd like to talk about today are some of the tensions between modernizing impulses that focus on or emphasize romantic love, companionate marriage, and self-development, and those focused on the cultivation of Muslim piety. My interest is simultaneously in teasing out the role that religion, in this case Indonesian Islam, can play in understanding the broader social and cultural effects of the phenomenon of delayed marriage or waithood, and more generally to consider the degree to which the waithood model is a useful framework for understanding the widespread pattern of extended singlehood in Indonesia. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay. So waithood refers to an extended period of young adulthood when young men and women wait basically to marry and have children. In some cases, the delays are indefinite and young people end up opting out of marriage altogether. That is, they never marry. Although in Indonesia, these cases of non-marriage are relatively rare. But young people opting out of marriage altogether is on the rise in many areas of the world and is viewed with alarm in countries like Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and even China. My colleague, Marcia Inhorn, who is at Yale University, and I have identified two basic types of waithood. One is unintentional, and the other is intentional. And these are simple, basic categories. In fact, there are multiple types of waithood that we talk about. But just to continue, in the case of unintentional waithood, we talk about a situation when delays in marriage and childbearing are the result of political and economic realities that force young people into a state of deferred adulthood. So in some cases, this could be the result of war or conflict or social unrest. For example, in many areas of the world, the inability to pay for a wedding or to secure steady employment or an adequate income to support a family or to buy a house so as to live separately from one's parents keep young people from marrying. These are all possible reasons for unintentional waithood. That is, people would love to, these are young people who would love to marry, but in fact, the possibilities aren't there. And you find this in many areas actually of the Middle East. Egypt, Iran is also experiencing some of these problems. A second type of waithood, however, is intentional waithood. An intentional waithood is when marriage delays are planned and experienced in aspirational terms. So for example, when men or women put off marriage and childbearing to pursue their education or to pursue a career, hoping to improve their life chances and also to improve the situation of their parents and their siblings. So to give something back to their parents before they marry. Now, waithood may be unintentional or intentional. It's also possible that it could be a combination of both. Those sorts of things happen as well. Okay, so I want to start by talking about some of the a little bit of the background to my own research. Actually, let's go back to this one a minute. So the focus of my research over the past 20 or 25 years has been on Muslim Javanese university students in Yogyakarta. I decided to work among university students because these are young people who, and you may all recognize this in yourselves as college students, are at a stage in their lives where they're consciously preoccupied with crafting a future while struggling to position themselves vis-a-vis changing social and religious context. While my interviews with young people included both men and women, I focused my attention mainly on young women because what I discovered is that they really are the ones who have experienced the most dramatic shifts in educational and economic opportunities over the past 25 years. Let's talk about the context. So this is a time, the context I'm talking about is a time of rapid social change when young Indonesians, as well as their parents and teachers, that is during this period of time at the fall of the Suharto period and after, when young Indonesians, as well as their parents and teachers and religious authorities in my study, recognized and frequently commented on the fact of that times had changed, that zaman sudah berubah, and things were changing rapidly. And today's youth are recognized as having many more opportunities than were available to older generations. Mark Lechte refers to these moments of rapid social and economic change as newly emergent conditions of possibility that support the emergence of an expanded middle class. And that's what, in fact, I'm arguing we saw in Indonesia during this time. The idea of socioeconomic conditions of possibility put forward by Lechte is that middle classes appear and expand through the convergence of socioeconomic forces in specific times and places that create conditions under which the middle class cultural logics and subject positions become possible and desirable. Lechte cites Raymond Williams and E.P. Thomas, who insist that we understand class as a historical category, not a model or a structure or a heuristic category, but a lived experience of, social life experienced over time. So what are some of these emergent conditions of possibility that we saw arising in the late 1990s and early 2000s in Indonesia that supported the expansion of a new middle class? During Suharto's New Order, I'm sure you're all aware of this, an aggressive family planning program was undertaken. Although, again, rather heavy-handed, the program was remarkably successful in reducing average family size. Family planning went hand in hand with the significant expansion of educational opportunities in both urban areas and also rural areas of the nation. And both of these factors led to the widespread recognition of the benefits of smaller, high quality families. And by high quality was meant education, educated children, and to new understandings of family and gender relationships and the role of children. So when you reduce family size and you have fewer children in the family, the expectations of parents in terms of what those children should do or how they behave often change. With fewer children, more attention was given to the education of not only boys, but girls as well. The expectation of parents shifted away from concerns with property and amassing property so as to hand it down to their children, to the investment in the education of children as a means of future security, even if it meant in some cases selling off property or going into debt. At the same time, New Order directives initiating compulsory schooling first succeeded in achieving near universal primary school education, and then dramatically increasing participation in secondary education and tertiary education. Tertiary education, of course, is college and university. The state made primary education compulsory first through 6th grade, and then beginning in 1989 through grade 9. Programs were simultaneously undertaken to increase the number of schools and teachers, improve teacher training, and the overall quality of schooling. And in addition, new employment opportunities in factories and the greatly expanded civil service and just general service sector acted as further incentives to parents to keep their children in school, meaning a well-paying job in the future and a foothold in the emerging middle class. Significantly, a lot of these new jobs that emerged at this time, especially in factory work, assembly, service jobs, and the civil service, were considered appropriate for women. And women were considered to be particularly well suited to those kinds of jobs that required dexterity and also certain kinds of emotional, capacities. And in fact, the expansion of education or educational and economic opportunities has overall affected the situation of girls and women, as I said, even more dramatically than men, allowing them to catch up with, and in some cases even surpass, male achievements. So here in 2014, according to UNESCO statistics, 82.47% of Indonesian young people were attending secondary school, and women's enrollments had essentially caught up with men at 99% gender parity. So that was the beginning of this sort of shift that you saw towards greater gender parity in the schools. World Bank statistics, sorry, let's see if I can get the next slide. World Bank statistics for the following year, which was 2015, indicate that at the tertiary level, that is in universities and college, women's enrollment at 32.8% surpassed men's at 29.4% in 2015. The expansion of educational opportunities has had a profound effect on, as I said, contemporary Indonesian, and particular, I looked mostly at Javanese family roles and gender conceptions. The most immediate index of this change has been the postponement of marriage and the prolongation of the period of unmarried singlehood. Young people, most markedly young women, are marrying at significantly older ages as they put off marriage until they finish their schooling. In 1965, well, actually, let's go by the slide. In 1960, 1/3 of all young Indonesian women were married by age 16. In the 70s, or by the 70s, only 10% were marrying at age 16. In 1965, the mean age at marriage for females in Indonesia was 18.6. By 1971, it was 19.2. In 1990, the mean age of marriage for females was 21.6. And according to the 2010 census, the mean age of first marriage for Indonesian females was 22.3, and these numbers have only continued to rise. Young people or mothers are also behind many of these changes. Interestingly, those mothers who were forced to leave school at a young age in order to marry, among the women that I surveyed, they were particularly insistent in interviews. They said that they wanted their daughters to finish their educations and go to work so that they wouldn't be dependent on their husbands and could help to support their parents and their siblings. So this part is important, and we'll come back to it. This idea of conditions of possibility that Mark Lechte identifies as critical to middle class formation needs to also include this important ideological components. That is, it's not enough to have just economic and social changes taking place. People also have to change their minds about what is possible. And we see that there was support at this time ideologically for changing gender roles. Although there were debates, nonetheless, there was support behind the idea of women's education and women working in the public sphere. So let's talk a little bit about women and work. World Bank statistics on women's employment offer confirmation of these patterns of Indonesian women taking advantage of new employment opportunities. Data for 2013, and I realize some of these data are dated, so to speak, but I have a problem getting data statistics that are comparable. So I'm looking for change over time, and sometimes the only statistics I can get give me a certain window and not the whole picture, but I give you some later statistics in a minute. So data for 2013 indicate that 47.6% of Indonesian women ages 15 and older were employed in wage position. The significance of these figures are very clear when they're compared with data from other Muslim majority countries. So for example, the percentage of Indonesian women ages 15 and older who are part of the workforce in these statistics is almost 4 times higher than the percentage of working age females employed in Jordan, which is 12.1%, and almost 3 times higher than the percentage of Egyptian women at 16.8%, and over twice as high as the percentage of working women in Tunisia and Morocco, which statistics I don't have up here. According to the social demographer Arian J. Utomo, who draws on data from Indonesia's Census Bureau of Statistics, the BPS, the percentage of Indonesian women in the labor force is even higher. It's 57% in 2000, up from 32% in 1971. So again, you see overall, women are working, Indonesian women are working. Yes, there are debates about it. Yes, there are constant challenges to it, but the statistics show that Indonesian women are head and shoulders above women in many other Muslim majority countries. So then the question becomes, how has this affected marriage patterns, which is what I'm particularly interested in. So as I said, most Javanese parents now recognize, and Indonesian parents in general recognize, the right of their daughters to choose their own husbands. And they often link that right directly to or explicitly to higher education and employment, saying, you know, I gave my daughter an education, my daughter can support herself or has helped us, so therefore I believe she can make her own choice or make a good choice in terms of a partner. Nevertheless, nevertheless, the great majority of parents also ask their daughters and their sons to put off serious involvement with the opposite sex, certainly while they're in high school, but sometimes during their time in college as well. Parents worry about the possibility that romantic involvements will lead young people to the desire to marry, or will result in pregnancy, which would, you know, bring shame on the family. But in both cases, the fear is that young women, and it's women more than men, that would drop out of school due to this. And yet, although Javanese parents warn their daughters to avoid relationships that could interfere with their studies and possibly keep them from graduating, they're also afraid of their daughters never marrying. That's also a tension. In fact, the possibility of not marrying is a source of tension, not only for parents, but for young people as well. There's a strong marital imperative in Indonesia and in Indonesian Islam, and young people, like their parents, regard marrying and having children as an absolute social and moral given. Women who reach their mid-20s and aren't married yet are considered to be old maids, or they call themselves old maids. They'll tell me, oh, I'm already, you know, a perawan tua. And anxious concern is expressed over their marketability, you know, and whether they laku, in particular, this issue of declining fertility. In addition to being a religious requirement and repayment of an important moral debt or balas budi to one's parents, marriage is also closely linked to the imperative that one provide a grandchild, some keturunan, or descendant to eager grandparents. And so along with, you know, the other friends who are asking, when are you going to marry and when are you going to marry, it's also parents who are often saying, you know, when are you going to produce a grandchild? And age 25 is cited very often as the optimal age for a woman to marry because it's considered the peak of a woman's fertility. And after that time, it's assumed that her ability to bear children begins to rapidly decline. The widespread delays, though, in youth marriage and this extended period of unmarried singlehood have led to repeated public moral panics. This is true not only in Indonesia, but elsewhere in the world where countries are experiencing this extended period of young people hanging around, so to speak, and not getting married or not getting married soon enough. and these panics typically focus on the fear of some kind of unchecked sexual licentiousness, free sex among unmarried youth. And yet it's interesting that despite the public panics and moral outcry, it's very hard to get official statistics that show clearly high levels of premarital sex among Indonesian youth. So Utomo again cites a very low figure of only 6%, based on official public health survey that was carried out by the Badan Kesehatan in the mid 2000s. So, but of course we know sexual activity among youth is very difficult to access, and it's very likely underreported. So complicating sort of measuring it or trying to figure out rates of premarital involvement, women who become pregnant out of wedlock are quickly married to their impregnators. And if the man can't be found, the pregnant woman will be married to a willing substitute. So it's very hard to get statistics on situations where marriage occurs very quickly. However, much higher figures of 30 or even 40% of youth engaged in premarital sex appear in unofficial studies and are used to inflame these sorts of, public panics over youth immorality. And I don't know if you're familiar with this ethnography that was written by Pam Nyland, who reports in her study that the young people, these were adolescents that she interviewed, they also cited moral decay as the foremost or the most critical problem facing Indonesian youth today. So it's not just parents and teachers who are concerned about this issue, it's also young people themselves. And other studies have shown that the current generation is actually even more conservative, both in terms of morals and religion, than their parents. Okay, so where does that lead us? All of the young people I interviewed expressed a certain anxiety over finding a marriage partner. However, the anxiety, as I said, is particularly acute among young women. Although the age of first marriage has risen for both men and women, as I said, the rise is most marked among women. And it's women who have been identified as the focus of what is sometimes referred to as the marriage crisis or the marriage squeeze. So this phenomenon of marriage crisis or marriage squeeze refers to the difficulties that many educated young women face in finding partners due to an imbalance in the number of available men, or to young women just putting off marriage for too long and aging out of the marriage market. Now, when I talk to young people about this, they often cite a statistical imbalance between the overall number of Indonesian men relative to women as creating this crisis. But statistics don't seem to bear this out. It's not the overall number of men relative to women that is the problem. The problem is the number of desirable men with the appropriate level of education. And so statistics, these were presented by Jones and Jung and Utomo also. She cites 76 tertiary educated men for every 100 tertiary educated women in the 25 to 29 age group. And just to give a comparison with earlier generations, there were 176 tertiary educated men for every 100 tertiary educated women in the 50 to 54 age group. So therefore, in the parental age group, you saw, women who were educated didn't have any problem finding an educated husband, but among the current young people, it's harder for tertiary educated women to find a man who is equally educated and desirable on other levels as well. And this is likely the source of this perceived squeeze. So facing a narrowing pool of marriageable men, educated women scramble to identify a partner who's both willing to negotiate work and family roles, but also to, work together to establish a modern, companionate, and romantic marriage. All right, so let's talk a little bit about marriage, this trends in marriage without courtship. So despite the difficulties that many educated women encounter in securing a marriage partner, very few say, as I said, that they don't want to ask their parents or their grandparents to help them, to find a partner. And rather than turning to parents, some Muslim women are turning to a variety of different types of marriage, of Muslim marriage brokers or matchmakers to find a partner. These women endorse the admonition heard in Muslim circles that all premarital sex or socialization, not sex, socialization with unrelated members of the opposite sex is sinful, and that in fact there's no dating in Islam, only ta'aruf, that is meeting for the purposes of deciding whether or not to marry. So at least some, and in fact it seems to be an increasing number perhaps, have decided that ta'aruf, or quickly marrying without extensive premarital familiarization, is a reassuring solution to a marriage market that's under pressure. Of course, not all young people are completely foregoing having a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And in fact, what's a little bit interesting or ironic is that many, or maybe more, young people who decide to marry quickly and without dating do so after breaking off from a long-term relationship. So in other words, there may be dating going on previously, and then at a certain point they decide they're going to get serious, and at that point they're going to marriage brokers and marrying without dating. But that doesn't necessarily mean they haven't dated in the past. Again, the refrain from conservative and hip, Ustad Gaul, is that young people who are in romantic relationships should simply putus aja, break it off and move on. That is, move on with life in a more religious direction, or hijrah. The hijrah movement has gained considerable momentum as a result of the examples set by Instagram influencers like Nata Reza and Warda Maulina, and Facebook groups like Indonesia Tanpa Pacaran, which reportedly has over 600,000 paying members. If you movements and organizations, which in fact are promoting practices that look very similar to what Foucault refers to as technologies or techniques or technologies of the self. That is, practices that allow individuals to effect by their own means a certain number of operations on their own bodies, minds, souls, and lifestyle. So in other words, taking up a certain kind of dress, or moderating or managing one's emotions in particular ways, or reciting Quranic verses to calm the self and transform the self in order to transform themselves to attain a certain state of happiness and quality of life. So this is very similar to what Foucault is talking about here. They are particularly interesting, these technologies of self, in as much as they seem to tap into young people's desire for pious self-improvement. That is, a kind of doing and getting better. In this case, specifically becoming or being better Muslims by offering a kind of road plan to also becoming better persons. Again, we're talking about technologies of the self, work on the self. One aspect of these movements is the phenomenon, which is increasingly popular, of large and small matchmaking events that are organized by religious individuals or organizations who are motivated by the conviction that it's their moral duty to help singles meet and marry. To enroll in these events, participants submit biodata to a committee, which then facilitates the exchange of data and subsequent meetings between partners. or participants. Of course, this can also happen on a very small scale with just a single usted who sets something up between a single individual with, one or two choices of the opposite sex. But these larger events require, these larger events can attract between 50 to several hundred singles. It's interesting that it's often more women than men, which again reinforces this notion of women reaching a certain age and trying to find possible partners, and perhaps being concerned about how to do that. The rules for participating are typically fairly strict. Of course, you have to be single. You have to be serious in your intention to marry. You have to be ready to marry quickly. Some of these organizations even agreed to pay for wedding expenses and even include, honeymoon package to go to Bali or Singapore. And in fact, this one allows for registration for free midwife services, which assumes that, you're going to marry, and of course you're going to get pregnant immediately after you marry. And these events are regularly featured in news articles and online media stories. And of course, in the West too, there are occasionally news stories talking about this new trend that's occurring in marriage patterns in Indonesia. Just an example, a story that I collected of an individual who went through one of these processes is Ning, who explained that she met her husband at a mass matchmaking event. And at the time I interviewed her, she was 36. She had a 2-year-old daughter, and she had married just before she turned 34 years of age. And she got pregnant immediately. At the time she married, Ning had already finished her BA, her Sarjana Muda, and had worked for some time as an assistant teacher at a school for children with special needs. She has since taken the national exam to become a civil servant and now has a full-time teaching position. Her husband, okay, here's the interesting part. Her husband is 2 years younger than she is. And in fact, he only has a grade school education. He makes a modest income as a sales clerk in an office supply store. The two share a serious religious orientation, and Ning's parents were reassured by her, her partner's polite and respectful demeanor. She explained to me, well, I was really anxious about marrying. I was already 34 and considered an old maid. My friends insisted that I go to this matchmaking event. In fact, they dragged me into a taxi and made me go. And she said, when I met the guy who would become my future husband, it was difficult for us to even find a time to meet and talk. We finally settled on, meeting at a mall, and we just walked around, and then we got something small to eat. I don't know why, she said, but I felt sympathy for him right away. Saya simpati. He seemed like a good person and very easygoing. We were both mature. We were both ready to marry. So I agreed to marry him. Because they were both serious and ready to marry, and because Ning was concerned about her age and very anxious to quickly have a child, just 1 week after they met, the couple decided to marry. The marriage took place as soon as arrangements could be made with their two families. That is nice to avoid sin. So what's also interesting is that although many young people do put off having serious relationships before marriage, there's room, as I said, in the Hijra movement for those who have had an uneven or, shady, let's say, past, but are willing to bertobat and to repent, to reform themselves. On the one hand, this opens the movement to a much larger pool of accessible, this is not exactly them, but a larger pool of accessible adherents. And on the other, it's an acknowledgement that not only is moral perfection difficult to achieve, but that religious piety is a project. In this process, as I said, moving on, or hijra, young people are encouraged, as I said, to leave behind and break with the past, possibly ending a current relationship, which was by definition a sinful relationship, to begin anew with a clean slate. Okay, let's conclude by talking a little bit about, okay, how does the waithood paradigm work for Indonesia? The short answer is yes. What we see in Indonesia, at least among the middle class or middle class Muslims, is a form of voluntary waithood, one that is gendered and moral rather than overtly political. As in so many other newly developing countries in the world, educational and economic expansion in Indonesia has resulted in significant marital delays for growing numbers of young people, especially in the ranks of the country's new Muslim middle class. Unlike some areas of the Muslim Middle East, however, the growing incidence and prolongation of waithood hasn't primarily been the consequence of male unemployment or the steeply rising costs of marriage, nor has the phenomenon been consistently linked to growing male frustration leading to depression or disillusionment or religious radicalism. Waithood's most striking social effect in Indonesia instead is seen in the difficulties faced by young educated women in identifying an appropriate marriage partner. Difficulties compounded by these women's age and educational attainment relative to the pool of available men. The social and cultural concomitants of the phenomenon of extended singlehood or waithood in Indonesia are also quite different from those reported, as I said, for the Muslim Middle East. They have had less to do with social unrest than with the concern of the Muslim public and a new generation of Muslim preachers to ensure that even as waithood and women's higher education has become part of the new Indonesian reality, the developments are brought squarely into alignment with Islamic ethical norms. And just to return for one final statement to Mark Lechty's discussion of these sort of conditions of possibility identified as critical to middle-class formation, I think the Indonesian case reveals that we need to, again, examine not only changing educational and employment opportunities that support the emergence of the new middle class, but also be mindful of the ideological component, that is here, the importance of Islam in both supporting and constraining shifting understandings of middle-class marriage and intimacy, family life, and gender roles. I think I'll end there. So perhaps there are some questions. I can stop the share screen. Let's see.
Alifa, where is Alifa, the moderator?
Am I audible?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Nancy, for the presentation. That was very enlightening. I'll try to summarize a little bit. So after Suharto fell from his dictatorship, Islam flourished in Indonesia, but so did neoliberal ideas in our society. So nowadays, the idea of choosing your own partner is the basis of the modern romance, as opposed to familial matchmaking. So with opportunities for education and employment, women now have more leverage in deciding their own marriage, because we're not looking to settle anymore. We want an equal partnership, still based on love, but also pragmatic. So waithood also produces a moral panic for the general public in Indonesia's religious-ish society, with concern of free sex. On that note, from the conservative Islam side of things, early marriage is encouraged. So it feels like our society is experiencing both ends of the extreme. You have the liberal-ish child-free movement, and they get criticism like, what's the point of marriage if you're not going to have children? And then you have the Indonesia tanpa pacaran movement, and then the criticism is like, marriage is a genuine commitment and we should not be encouraging 20-year-olds to go through that and all that. So yeah, let's go to the Q&A session. If you have any question, feel free to write it on the chat column or just unmute yourself. Anyone has any questions? Because this is honestly quite a relatable topic. Okay, we have one hand raised from Monica Sri Yuliarti. Monica? Hello.
Hi. Hi, Alifa. Thank you so much. I'm gonna just ask a question to Professor Nancy, and I'm just curious about the value of love in this case, because you mentioned early that some of them doesn't know much about their future husband or their future spouses. And as far as I know, a marriage is something that must have initial process, like interpersonal relationship. You have to know your spouse and you have to understand their habit, what are their likes and something like that. But in this case, in your study, it is say that they even just need a week from meeting someone and then get married to them. I mean, it is something that I could never imagine happened to me, for example, because, you know, a marriage is, there is no way back from a marriage, especially for Muslim women, even though there is divorce. I mean, we can divorce, but in our society, if someone has been divorced, then the people will look at us differently, right? So I'm just curious about the value of love and in this marriage and how they cope with the problem. I mean, a marriage, most of the people who got married after they have dating for maybe 5 years or 7 years, at some point they will find some difficulties too. The problem will arise. And compared to this kind of relationship who only needs a week for marrying someone, how would they cope if there is something wrong happen in their marriage? Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Alifa.
Okay, when you, Professor?
Sure. That's a very big question, right? And of course, there is a lot of diversity among college students on this point, on the issue of romance and so on. I think Alifa said something in her summary which was really interesting, which is, yes, of course, young people are romantic and associate, you know, being romantic with being modern, but they're also practical. And actually, I was surprised at the degree of practicality I found among Indonesian university students when they talked about marrying. I was not shocked, but surprised that many young people said, well, I have a plan. You know, I'm going to finish my degree by this age. I'm going to, you know, meet someone by this age, and then I'm going to marry by this age and have a child by this age. You know, they were very methodical in sort of thinking about how this was all going to work, even at a point when they didn't yet even have a partner, right? So that was interesting to me, the practicalities that were kind of interwoven with any notions of romance. And of course, to answer your question about the groups that suggest marrying without dating or ta'aruf, of course, you've probably heard what their response is, which is that romance is more romantic after you're married. So you're sort of pacaran setelah menikah. Dan itu jauh lebih romantis daripada, you know, pacaran sebelumnya. And this interesting argument, which is the opposite of what you were saying. Your comment was, so you get to know someone, you get to know what they're really like, you try to figure out, are you a good fit? And your comment was, maybe you could even know them for 5 years, and then suddenly you decide, oh, you see something you didn't like. But again, the sort of tanpa pacaran people, their response to that is that during dating, the kinds of interactions you have are false, because everyone is trying to sell themselves as a marriage partner. And so, it's not true, and your emotions in that state are not true. Now, you can believe that or not believe that, but yeah, so those are at least some of the responses. But I think the other thing that's interesting to me is that, again, in talking to youth, I think people, even those who enter into ta'aruf and are part of the, Indonesia Tanpa Pacaran group, they often have had some kinds of relationships. And the decision to go to ta'aruf is often a decision to break with the past. So they've decided that those kinds of relationships were not real or genuine, and they want to start new, clean slate.
Okay, any feedback from Mbak Monica?
Oh no, thank you. It's enough, but it is interesting, I think, because yeah, maybe because I'm not I don't have this kind of friend around me that going with this kind of relationship. So when I asked you about the common stages for a romantic relationship and marriage, something that I've never imagined before, but it is so interesting. Thank you, Professor, for the answer. Thank you, Alifa.
Okay, anyone else want to ask something else? The next question. Because this is definitely a relatable topic for all of us. We're all university students in here, and we're all in the reproductive age. And sure, maybe for me personally, it's more of an economic concern, because sure, a traditional family would look nice, but I'm just not sure if I could afford that,
You don't know if you could afford it economically?
No, it's not just the marriage, because I don't want a wedding, I want a marriage, and that's a much more heavy responsibility. And I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like in 5 years or so, I'll change my mind, but not now. Me being a broke university student, nah, not for me.
So,
what about my friends?
So you are an example
Sorry?
of delaying marriage. Because you want to
20 years
continue
old,
your education and get a job and get your life together.
Yeah, but I'm not as methodical as the other people that you described, because I don't know what's gonna happen in the future. I have a lot of anxiety about the future, and I'm sure this is relatable for all of us. We're all scared. We don't know what is going to happen next, especially with the COVID-19 and all that. It's just, I don't know.
Right.
Does this also happen to your friends? Yeah. Mungkin,
Absolutely,
ya.
Absolutely.
Teman-teman di sini bisa bertanya dengan bahasa Indonesia ya, silakan.
Ya bisa.
Ya, silakan, nanti saya bantuin.
Nah, Bu Nancy juga bisa paham sekali bahasa Indonesia. Oke.
Ayo kawan-kawan, mau curhat juga boleh. Okay, we have a question from Diva Andina. So I'll read the question out. Based on the journal I've read, there's a statement that many public policies made in the reform era of Indonesia are aimed at controlling women's bodies. One of the political policies of the female body is KB. Also because of that, women no longer have the authority over their own body. Then what do you think about that statement? Do you think that the policy of using KB can be said as controlling women's bodies? Okay, so what would Foucault probably think about the KB policy? Professor?
Well, sure. I mean, definitely there were, as I described it, it was a very heavy-handed kind of policy. And there was evidence too of some women experiencing forced sterilization or being forced to use IUD or other sorts of procedures, right? And especially the connection with having to get permission from, you know, a husband to take some sort of birth control or not take or go off birth control. And there were all sorts of controls that were involved in the KB program. But having said that, you know, it's interesting that policies can both be positive and negative, right? They can have some positive effects as well as negative effects. And yes, I think the control aspect, the heavy-handed aspects of KB were controlling of women's bodies. On the other hand, the downstream effects in terms of smaller family size, as I said, is positively linked to increases in education for women. So, you know, we see this in China too. So the birth control policies, family planning policies in China were also drastic, right? One child only, and then only later was it possible to have two, and then more recently now they're worrying about not having replacement population, and they've moved to encouraging 3. But at any rate, the policy that resulted in only 1 or 2 children in a family meant that both girls and boys were given attention. If you only have 2 children, and what if they're both girls? You have to, you know, you're educating them both. Or if you have 1, you're putting all your money into the education of that girl. So despite the negative controlling aspects on the one hand, there were some positive aspects. And then further downstream, negative aspects. Because of the one-child policy in China and families choosing either through using, you know, technologies to choose boys over girls, or using other sorts of techniques like giving girls away for adoption. Now there's an incredible skew in terms of the number of available men relative to the women. So in China, it's a situation where there are many more men than women. So there's, again, a marriage squeeze, a marriage crisis, but it's for a very different reason. And it's skewed in a different direction. So.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Professor Nancy. Let's go right into the next question. This is from Titi Fitrianita. What an insightful research, Professor. I have plenty of friends who is in the range of marriage age. Some are beyond the age limit. They're highly educated and having good careers. They're looking for equally highly educated and equally good career men, which every qualified man they are looking for has already married and have a family, while becoming a second wife would never ever become an option. Would you please explain how this delaying marriage women overcoming pressure from the society and the pressure from themselves, Professor Nancy?
Well, I'm not sure how I can speak for these women in the sense of how they internally, you know, struggle with pressure from society and pressure inside themselves. I mean, I think it's real that if women do want to continue their educations and they do want to pursue a career, this is true in the States too. They face certain kinds of pressure. In the States, you know, the problem of marrying late and then facing fertility issues is very real. There's some movement towards you know, freezing eggs, but it's very expensive and it hasn't been proven to be particularly successful. And I mean, I think the percentage of women who actually can do it is fairly small. So what can I say? I mean, this is a common problem, and it's becoming more and more common as more countries in the world face this similar pattern of women getting education, delaying marriage, getting careers, going into the workforce, and then looking around and not being able to find quality men. So think about it too. It used to be, this is probably true for Indonesia as it's true for the US. In the United States, it used to be that in the grandparental generation, your grandparents maybe married somebody that was in their neighborhood, right? Somebody they knew. And they went to high school with them, and then they married their high school sweetheart. And then in the next generation, it was maybe they married somebody in college, right? But now the problem is that since women are delaying marriage, they have no more, what's the word? They have no more group, no more pool from which to find a spouse. And of course, going to your neighborhood or your high school, you know something about the person, so you feel more comfortable, right? As opposed to going online and trying to sift through all these pictures of men and choose somebody that you think is going to work for you. So there are all sorts of issues that come into play here. Greater mobility, which is true for Indonesians too, right? You move away from your village or your town. You move from city to city to find a job, and you lose your reference group. And that would be the group that you would use to find a husband or a wife. And but you've lost that contact. Or all those people are married. And as you said, you're not interested in becoming a second wife. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Nancy, what do you think about, is there any possibility of the modern women being persuaded by the conservative Islam response, and maybe they will settle for being second wives or third, because polygamy is still common here in Indonesia? It is becoming less and less common, but what do you think?
I think it's complicated, right? And certainly among the women that I interviewed, there were, okay, so this is how it usually went. The women who were particularly religious, conservatively religious Muslims would say, yes, polygyny is allowed within Islam. I recognize it is legal, it's allowed. But I don't want it for me. So they simultaneously recognized, okay, it's fine for other people. It's religiously sanctioned, but I don't want it for me. So that was one thing. The second thing is that, of course, there have been some big, movie stars and public persons that have become second wives. In some cases, some professional women told me that they really just wanted a husband part-time because they were busy. But I wasn't sure if I trusted them to really. So they said, okay, well, I'm going to marry as a second wife because, I just want my own house. And I don't want to be bothered all the time. And I want to have a child. So, okay. But I think there's also this problem of if you reach a certain age, there are fewer choices. So maybe somebody who wouldn't normally consider becoming a second wife might consider it. But education works against that, because the more educated you are, the less possibility you're going to put up with polygyny. So.
But now that you put it that way, a husband that will leave me alone half the time doesn't sound too bad, honestly.
I think actually there are some women who might feel that, certainly in the abstract, maybe not in the reality.
Yeah, in theory, all right.
Yeah, in theory, okay, maybe, but in reality, it's very complicated, right?
It is. Okay, we have another question, this time from our very own Pak Arjo. Bagaimana Profesor Nancy mengkaji banyaknya kasus perceraian di Indonesia sekarang yang terjadi karena perkawinan dini, belum siap berkeluarga karena beratnya berumah tangga, atau karena bargaining position, perempuan Indonesia yang semakin berpendidikan, punya keterampilan, sehingga punya penghasilan dan mempunyai posisi tawar yang kuat, sehingga tidak khawatir jika dicerai oleh suaminya. What phenomenon is this?
So I really would love to see some good divorce statistics, and I can't say that I have them. I also don't trust them, because the problem with divorce, similar to problems with trying to get other sorts of statistics, is that because divorces, they're often going through religious courts, there's enormous pressure on people to stay married. So I don't know if I trust what statistics are available. I'm always looking for them. So if there are good statistics out there, I'd love to have them. People did express to me concerns that divorce rates are rising for especially these reasons, that women, are more independent and they can support themselves. I mean, that would certainly seem to be work in women's favor, but I don't have the statistics to really know. All I have are anecdotes, right? And so I just don't know.
Okay, so we don't have the statistics to back it up, but it sure is a phenomenon that's interesting to further research.
Right.
Okay. Next question is from Anissa Sabrina. Good morning, Professor. Nowadays, there are many Indonesian teenagers, especially girls, who delay their marriage and even choose not to marry because of the trauma that they have in their family, and also trauma of the opposite sex, including trauma having a relationship, and most of them now prefer to be independent regardless of what you've explained about the several factors that cause widowhood to occur. What is your opinion about this issue in terms of delaying marriage women? So trauma from the patriarchy, that is certainly an interesting theory. What do you think, Professor?
So the next research I really am interested in doing is to talk to women who have decided not to marry. Okay, so in the hundreds of young people that I talked to in my previous research, virtually nobody said they didn't want to marry. So they said, okay, later, I want to put it off, delay, but they all said, no, but eventually I want to marry. And, but I think since that time, there has been more discussion and more possibilities for some women to actually decide that they don't want to marry. And I'd love to interview them and find out. There are categories of women. I think there are categories of women. For example, there are women who delay marriage. They delay marriage for so long that they get comfortable. Then they're like, hey, I'm not married. I don't care. I'm fine. They can adopt a niece or, whatever, if they want companionship, and they're fine. So that's one possibility. You just delay so long that, okay, it happens. There could be a category of women who, maybe they're just not interested in men, either because they're not interested in sex, or perhaps they're lesbians, or they're not sure about their sexuality, or whatever. And they decide, okay, I'm just going to keep going to school and keep delaying marriage, and then I'm happy alone. And then, of course, there's the issue of either divorcees or widows, who also, are women alone, living alone. And the question I would like to talk to those who decide, okay, I'm not going to remarry, right? Because I had a husband and he was okay, but now I want to try something different, right? And so the question of how do these women deal with public pressure, familial pressure to marry again, would be very interesting. And what I suspect is that if a woman has enough income, that is, if she has the stability to support herself and is comfortable, and maybe even the stability to support other family members, maybe they'll leave her alone and allow her, say, okay, fine, you want to not remarry. So, but I'm curious, because Indonesia really is one of those countries that is categorized as the country with universal marriage. What does universal marriage mean? It means that something like less than 4 or 5% of women who are age 40 or above have never been married. So less than 5% of women are never marrying is basically it, and have never been married. And I'm curious as to whether that's changing. These are statistics by this sociologist Gavin Jones. I don't know if he's still working on this. His statistics are terrific, but I think he's sort of retiring. So I haven't seen anything recently. He even did a great book on divorce, but it was, you know, it's not current. So I don't know what's happening in terms of divorce. And then in terms of this idea of never marrying. So I would have to use an ethnographic approach and just go out there and talk to women who identified themselves as women who just basically didn't want to marry. That'd be very interesting to me.
Yeah, but I have many friends, Prof. Nancy, who decide, or they said that over 40 years, they said that this is not time for me to, I mean, not interesting again about marry. So, jadi seperti kalau saya dapat jodoh, oke, tetapi kalau tidak, ya sudah, karena 40 tahun itu sudah bukan lagi prioritas, begitu. Itu banyak sekali yang bilang seperti itu memang.
Banyak?
Ya, ada teman saya mungkin ada sekitar berapa ya? Sementara ya, ada sekitar 5 ada yang memang dia tidak.
So I will come looking for you when I'm looking for your response.
Saya juga punya bibi ya, adik ibu begitu yang dia sudah berumur mungkin 50 lebih dan tidak menikah. Itu juga ada. Ya, mungkin bisa research selanjutnya. Mari saya bantu.
I think it would be interesting to compare to the other sorts of responses that I get. So there's more questions, maybe? What? It's hard to hold on.
Just one more before we close.
Boleh bertanya, moderator?
Oke, kepada Dr. Istar Yuliadi, silakan.
Baik, terima kasih pada Profesor Nancy. Saya mau bertanya, bagaimana pendapat Profesor mengenai pengaruh extended family terhadap keputusan bercerai dalam perkawinan?
Yeah, again, divorce isn't something that I've been able to research very much. I'm very interested in divorce, and I did make an attempt. One of my summer research projects was to try to get to the bottom of what was happening, because there has been a lot of discussion about, you know, an increase in divorce, precisely for the reasons that, was it Argio mentioned, of, you know, women becoming more independent because of having greater economic means and education to get divorced. But I really couldn't get to the bottom of that. But certainly the issue of family pressure to stay married was tremendous. And women talked about that and talked about the, you know, difficulties of convincing family members that they really wanted out of the marriage. And that it was very difficult to do in many cases. Yeah. So that's a good point. All of these questions have been great questions, actually. All of your points have been very interesting and useful for thinking.
Ya, saya lanjutkan, Profesor. Bagaimana pendapat Profesor mengenai wanita berani mengambil keputusan menceraikan suami?
What's my opinion of a woman who takes a step to divorce her husband?
Yes.
It's hard to respond in general. It really depends on the case, right? Is she being selfish, or is she being beaten up by her husband? Or is he, you know, is he a bad husband? Or it's hard to say in the abstract, right? It's a very specific case by case sort of issue. certainly I feel strongly that women should have the option of divorcing, of getting out of a relationship if they're not happy or if they're being mistreated. Same thing for a husband, right?
Ya, terakhir Profesor, pertanyaan terakhir. Apakah Profesor setuju penyebab konflik di dalam perkawinan itu ada 3 hal? Yang pertama, sexual matters. Yang kedua, economic matters. Yang ketiga, communication. Profesor setujukah atau punya pendapat lain?
I certainly think those are probably among the most important. Yeah.
Thank you. Ya. Terima kasih moderator.
Okay, thank you for the questions, Pak Istar. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today because it's already 9:30. Thank you for the discussion, Professor Nancy. It was fun, enlightening, and educating. Thank you for the answers. And now for a photo session. So if everyone could open their cameras, please. Okay, who is going to take the picture? Bu Yuyun? My screen is not loading a lot.
Okay, just turn on your camera and you will take a picture. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, one more, the second slide. 1, 2, 3. And the third slide. 1, 2, 3. Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
So thank you to everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear what you think, and the questions were very, very interesting. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Nancy.
Sure.
We've come to the end of our event. So thank you for everyone for joining us here today. And I hope this has been beneficial for all of us. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Also, don't forget to fill out the attendance list it's in the chat column. Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Terima
thank
kasih
you.
banyak yang sudah hadir. Terima kasih banyak Ibu Nancy sudah for supporting us for the discussion.
Argyo and Bu Yuyun and Alifa, you were great. Everyone's English is so